Welcome to episode 224 of the Shared Security Show. And joining me this week, I have the privilege of having a very special guest on the show today. And that special guest is Josh Feinblum, who is the president, COO, and co-founder of Stavvy. Welcome to the show, Josh.
Thanks for having me. You know, Tom and I were talking right before we started recording about how long it's been
Oh my gosh.
since we caught up, and I mean, we spent meaningful time together back in the day, and then just poof, it's amazing. Like
Yeah.
it blows my mind.
OWASP AppSec DC, I think was,
2009.
yeah, 2009. Oh my gosh. We were a lot younger back then.
Yeah, let me just say, last time I saw you, you didn't have white hair.
Oh, I have white hair now. You do after all those years. It's yeah, you can't stop aging, unfortunately.
Not yet.
No, not yet. Maybe you could start a startup that will stop aging for all of us as your
Yeah,
next
I
venture.
like starting companies that have potential to make money in the relatively near future.
Yes, yes. So it's great having you on the show. I know we haven't talked in a long time, but maybe for our audience, can you maybe talk a little bit about yourself and your background and this thing called Stavvy?
Yeah, I mean, I always start with, like, I am a lifelong technologist. I started writing code when I was about 10. Um, Although I never called myself an engineer, and pretty quickly thereafter, I got involved in the security community. Well before we would call it that. And spent like the next 25 years of my life, from young adulthood well into my career, at what I like to call the intersection of technology and evil. Uh, I hope Kevin doesn't sue me.
If
I'm
Kevin
not did
was
not
here,
say
that'd be, yeah,
I did
professionally evil.
yeah, I did not say I'm professionally evil, Kevin, so call the
Good.
lawyers off. And you know, uh, it was a journey. I mean, it wasn't just technical security work, it was trust and safety, fraud and abuse, privacy, legal and law enforcement operations, and, so really, and then ultimately being able to be a part of the teams that were taking or getting a couple of companies, really, wonderful technology companies ready to go public. And then, I went to MIT to get my MBA. I went through their executive program, and I met a bunch of people there, obviously. And then the December after we graduated, one of my classmates, who started a law firm a couple decades ago, that's now one of the largest transactional real estate firms in New England, and they own some title companies around the country as well. Uh, you know, Basically asked me if I wanted to work on a tech startup with him, and like that. I've always been entrepreneurial. I've always wanted to do a startup. I had been tiring for several years of the security industry for many reasons. Never really had an interest in trying to start a security company. And so after working with them on a little bit, you know, it became pretty clear that we were good partners, and that we were working to transform some really important industries, and industries that needed transforming. And so it became a no brainer. So I left. I put up the I hung up the keyboard. I don't think I'm allowed to say that because I didn't actually hang up the keyboard, but
Uh-huh.
I hung up the professionally evil TM keyboard, and started Stavvy with Costa.
Nice. Nice. And I mean, let's be honest, like I totally understand why you started that business because like mortgage processing, all of that paperwork and everything, like that's just like it's a nightmare, right? If you ever buy a house, right? Anyone will tell you, at least like maybe before you guys were created, it was a
Mhm.
nightmare.
Still, and if you think it's bad for the consumer, wait till you get behind into what happens in the post-closing and the capital markets and the servicing and all that stuff. I mean, like, we're burning, like, millions of acres of trees a year right now, and driving God knows millions of miles, for shipping, packages. I mean, Tom, there's literally parts of this process where somebody somewhere prints a document, packages it, ships it, and then it's received by somebody who opens the package, scans it in, right? Like, I'm like, if only there was a way without printing 100 pages and priority overnighting a document, across the country, or at least across the state, probably more frequently. Like, if only there was a way, right, that we could transmit it electronically in a safe way. I don't know if anybody invents that, they're going to be
Ah,
rich.
yeah, they would be. Wow, if we only had that technology. Jeez. Yeah, and I guess that leads me to like just ask you a question about like obviously with what you're trying to do there. I mean, there's obviously privacy and cybersecurity things you have to think about, and I think your background, you were a CISO in the past. Whether or not you loved being a CISO, probably debatable, but did that give you kind of the experience you needed to think about how you would integrate cybersecurity and privacy into what you're trying to build?
Totally. I mean, first, I did love being a CISO. It's just an exhausting job, and it's exhausting because we live in a world where still people still view that role as a B or C level executive, and so
Yeah.
like somebody who is a CFO and runs finance could, may not be typical, but nobody would bat an eye if the HR function reported to them, right? Why? Because they're leaders. But the CISO, nope, nope. Like, and you're still seeing a change, but I loved the job. I loved the people I worked with. I mean, I spent like a lifetime, almost an entire career, doing it. So I don't want to come off. I was just ready. I was ready for something new.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I mean, I frequently say that we're working with some of the most regulated entities in America who are facilitating arguably the most regulated consumer-facing transactions in the world. And certainly, privacy and security plays a role in that. Some of the uh, some of the most significant areas of cybercrime that continue to expand in the wire fraud arena heavily target this world. And so, yeah, I think being a security practitioner offers two benefits. The first is if you're really good, and I don't want to imply that I was really good, but I don't think I was terrible. So let me just say, if you're a decent practitioner, uh, if you're working across industries, you very quickly get adept at learning how each of these industries operates, at being able to pick apart, how the systems that connect these industries work. You don't get intimidated when you're going from healthcare to education to banking because you've seen, almost every flavor. And so even though you're looking through one lens, right, the hard part isn't actually for many people applying that one lens. It is the sense making about what you're looking at. And so I think from us bringing the ability to tear apart, right, uh how each of these industries operates, and then get into this new behemoth. It was the security background. um it made me a lot less intimidated about the fact that there's a lot of stuff I didn't know, because that's just how we always operate in the security industry. And then we also know how technology works, right? Again, we're looking through a different lens, but knowing how to build, technology, and the teams that work on technical problems, and how to create teams that have a great culture. Like, none of that's just exclusive to security. It is beneficial, right, to be able to jump on the phone with prospective customers and be able to talk through, what we're doing from a security perspective, and to be able to do it, probably better than any of our competitors, just because, you know, it's what I've always done, and to be able to bake security in, and there's a lot of things, both culture, security. Like, if you're stupid enough to take something called risk capital, you need to believe that you can build a multi-billion-dollar business, or you shouldn't take risk capital. And if you're stupid enough to believe that, then you should say, okay, like, what do we learn in security? Right? We learn it's a lot easier to start with it than to come in, when you're 400 employees and say, now it matters. Same thing goes with culture. And so, really being able to bake that stuff in from the beginning, and just sometimes it's as simple as talking and thinking about it. I mean, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I totally agree. So what is one thing that comes to mind in terms of like what was your biggest challenge when it comes to cybersecurity and privacy when you were building Stavvy?
you know, it's a good question, because I don't know I have a good answer for you to what was my biggest challenge, because I think I think like for a few reasons. One, we were well capitalized. So very early on, I think within our first 35 or 40 employees, I hired somebody I'd known for 15 years, who's our vice president of trust and security. Right. And so, and now Stavvy's 142 employees, and we have 12 people in our trust and security team. And so when you have that type of capital, she's also responsible for site reliability. And so when you're able to blend those two things together, and you're able to invest like that in a function, it's kind of unfair for me to like, like get like say, oh, get money, right? Like it's kind of a cop out. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of people that are going to be trying to build uh, security teams at startups where they're not as well capitalized, or they're not able to secure as much budget as we've allocated here. And it's always, I mean, it's always just the same thing. Is go back to the basics, right? From the very beginning, like everything needs two-factor authentication, right? It's basically like don't do stupid shit that we know hurts us, right? But we can't. But the majority of our careers are going into like these huge enterprises and trying to undo, decades of mistakes, right? Avoid those mistakes from the beginning, because it very rarely is a substantial tax to do that. And so if you're a security practitioner, there are basics like create an environment as much as possible where like patching is change, like patching the base AMI, and then watching is like the rest of your environment magically patches, right? Like building horizontally scalable, decentralized, cloud-based ecosystems. Like don't set up Active Directory, right?
Yep, number one.
Like no Active Directory, right?
Yeah.
Like all Macs. I don't.
Mhm.
I'm not. That's not a statement that one's more secure than the other, but it certainly
Right.
means no jerk's going to come in a few years later and set up Active Directory, right? And so it's going back to the basics, and like doesn't matter how long you've been in security, like there are certain things that are wrong and they're bad. And if you start from the beginning and you just tell people how it's gonna like this is necessary and why, then people are joining they're joining an environment where those basics are in place. And that, I mean, you can tell me if you disagree, but to me the most painful part of the job always was going into places and having to undo, 5, 10, 15 years of mistakes.
So imagine this scenario. You're out of the office unexpectedly, and a colleague pings you because they need access to some system you have credentials for. Now, our listeners would never send passwords over email or Slack, right? But what about your coworkers? How many organizations out there are sending logins back and forth in plain text? Worse yet, how many just store all of their logins on a shared spreadsheet? We all know that human errors are the biggest threat to your organization's security. But did you know that weak or stolen passwords account for over 80% of all data breaches? Now, there are tools out there that can allow you to share credentials, set access permissions, and monitor the dark web for stolen logins. And Keeper Security's enterprise password management platform does just that. Keeper locks down logins, payment cards, confidential documents, API keys, and database passwords in a patented zero-knowledge encrypted vault. And it takes less than an hour to deploy across your organization. Sign up for a Keeper free trial for your organization today and get a free 3-year personal plan. Stop sharing emails and spreadsheets with the keys to the kingdom. Get started by visiting keepersecurity.com/shared security.
You want your organization to be secure and compliant and to have a healthy culture, but your employees' lack of awareness makes you vulnerable to data theft, fraud, and compliance penalties. It's frustrating that the boring, static training content that's being used today has failed to improve employees' ability to defend against cyber attacks. At ClickArmor, we know that without using gamification, it's extremely hard to get staff to understand how to avoid threats. Our gamified simulations and challenges have provided a 50% average improvement in thousands of employees' ability to spot phishing threats. Go to clickarmor.ca/shared security to get your free gamified phishing assessment for up to 500 employees. You'll see quickly how gamified simulations can help your team be more resilient and compliant and help avoid costly ransomware and fraud incidents. Let ClickArmor help you go from being an underappreciated, stressed out fall guy to being an innovative leader who's the catalyst for greater productivity in your organization.
That kind of leads me to a question about just talking with other startups. And I did work, I worked for Veracode for 5 years, and that was a startup as well, and then was acquired 3 times. And so went through a journey. But I always remember, like, one of the biggest challenges that we saw in cybersecurity with these companies was tech debt, right? You start building a system, and then you start adding things, and it gets complicated, and new developers come in, new leadership, and all of that. Like, how does a startup start thinking about, like, from the beginning, like, how do you build an environment that doesn't end up having so much tech debt that it becomes like a security and a privacy nightmare to manage?
Um, well, let's suppose there's a way. Like, you have to be first honest, which is when you're an early stage startup, like it is a fight for survival, right? It's as simple as that. And so, um, again, like I don't want to cop out and say you go back to the basics, but uh, because no, like it doesn't matter what you do, there's going to be tech debt. The question is how can you like what can you do that minimizes tech debt that can cause the type of pain that you're discussing, right? And that's really hard. It's really hard for an early stage company or any company that's growing very, very quickly. And I almost want to say like Fantasyland hard. I think the better question is how do you make sure that you're addressing your tech debt at a cadence that doesn't mean that all of a sudden 4 years from now you're going to be left with 2 years of work to undo a bunch of stuff. We've definitely made decisions and assumptions and things that over the past 2.5 3 years have led us to have projects where we've had to like step back and slow down important work to make sure that the product can scale. And I honestly don't know how to give advice, right? Because to that question, because I will say one thing about not being the CISO here is I was just talking with Sarah, who is our VP of Trust and Security, a few hours ago about this, which is it is like I have a lot more respect for the challenges that many of the executives that I've worked for in the past have faced, where like things as a CISO that are frustrating, uh, like I get now, like I understand because you're a lot of times you're forced to make impossible trade offs. For us, knowing the types of transactions that we're facilitating and the capital structure that we have, like we invest in it, and uh, you know like if we have to stop 6 weeks for 6 weeks and redirect, 3/4 of the engineering team to go and fix tech debt so it doesn't become untenable, we do that. We've done it. And but I struggle to say that's what you need to do because there are a lot of early stage companies that actually can't do that or they won't survive. And so that's when I would go to my cop out, which is if you start with a strong foundation, right? If you start with a strong foundation and you make thoughtful trade-offs, um, you should be able to make the tech debt. It'll still accumulate and it'll still be meaningful, uh, but hopefully not catastrophic.
Yeah. Yeah, so thinking about your journey through a startup, and thinking about maybe lessons learned, right? Like, what's some advice that you could give someone that's just getting into a startup or thinking about doing a startup? Like, what should they be thinking about?
Those are two very different like categories of advice. If you're thinking about doing a startup versus joining a startup, so I'm gonna start with joining a startup.
Yeah,
Maybe part two can be doing a startup.
yeah.
Uh, joining a startup, um, like the first is only take the job if you really understand and believe that you can make security an enabler, right? I mean, like there's all sorts of different practitioners, and they're all important. They all play an important role, right? But you've got to be in an enablement mindset. You've got to be comfortable living in a risky environment, and it's really about what can you do in your capacity to minimize catastrophic risk to the business. um, it's a very different world in most startups than it would be if you're going to even like a 500-person company or a 1,000-person company or beyond. And so you're starting and you have to be comfortable working in an environment where you think you know what's happening and then 2 weeks later stuff changes. And so it's a lot of it's mental preparation and just understanding and being realistic about what you're strong at. If you're the type of person that like, is very philosophically like you just are morally tied to like everything needs to be buttoned up and perfectly secure, like an early stage startup is not for you because it's
No.
never going to happen.
Yep. Agreed. Yeah. That's good advice. Yeah, maybe we can make the part two if we can get Kevin to join us to talk about the other one. But yeah, it's that's what I always said too. And joining a startup was, if you don't like change, that's not for you, because things change constantly and people are coming and going, and it's just very volatile. But that is the nature of a startup.
Well, I don't know what
Is that
startups you go
volatility.
to. At Stavvy, people come, but not a lot of people go.
That's good.
We're very lucky.
You are very lucky.
Knock on wood.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Just really happy to see your success. And, it sounds like you don't miss the security industry that much. So that's.
It like that. What you just said is not a true statement. In fact, you know what? Like the security industry has lost a lot of people over the past 12 to 18 months, people that were in their prime.
Yeah.
Um, and, I think like like my social life was, basically the security industry growing up and through my entire career. So it's not that I don't miss the security industry. I miss it dearly. Right.
Yeah. Fair enough. Yep.
It's more a function of, um, I I think that in the security industry, unless you're at a very special company, it's very hard uh, to really maximize the impact you can have as a human being on the place that you're
Mhm.
at, right? In an
Yeah.
industry where the organizational structure is such that your biggest wins are when nothing happens,
Yeah.
right? Like that's like it's just like that's the part I don't miss, but I miss the security industry. I mean, it's hard. Like people, I don't know how it's changed. I honestly haven't been terribly involved in the industry in the past 5 years, but people that were involved in the security industry in the early 2000s through the turn of the 2010s, uh, like it was really like I don't know that we'll ever. I don't like saying never, but I don't know that we'll ever see in technology an industry like that because it was quite literally a bunch of kids and young adults that grew up knowing each other's handles, right?
Yeah. That's
Before
true.
the time of Google, and uh, and then you ultimately like you got a job, and now you could afford to like go to these conferences, and then you started to put like faces and names to these handles. Some people that you've known for 5 or 10 years, like since you were a teenager, in your early teens, like technology is never going to have like I don't know. I don't see a future where like people that were born in the mid 70s to the mid 80s that got interested in security have experienced something that I think is incredibly unique and very improbable to be replicated. So yeah, I
Yeah.
miss it a
You're
lot.
right. Yeah, yeah, and I think, like you said, the people, right? I don't know if we'll ever see, just because, like, we were at the infancy of infosec, right? It was just really kind of a thing, right? And I think that all started when, like Sarbanes-Oxley, and like there was mandates now to create a security department, and things, kind of evolved from there. But yeah, like it's the same thing. I mean, I grew up, a hacker, and that hacker culture I saw throughout my career kind of change and evolve. And people that I respected, I think of like Mudge and Weld Pond, that were speaking in front of Congress about the internet is a dangerous place. And then next thing you know, Weld Pond, he became, he created Veracode, right? And now
And
all
now
of
now
us,
we call him Chris. Like what?
now we call him Chris, right? But that's what I mean is like we're all now in positions where either starting companies or we're like I'm an AVP in a company, and it's just so interesting now how we're seeing kind of this next generation. But this next generation is just so different, and nothing against the next generation. It's just very different than what our experience was.
Look, like I would one of my least favorite questions to get was basically from somebody that was trying to figure out how to get into security that was just coming out of college. 'Cause, like, I don't I don't know. I never could answer that question. I was like, "Well, you have to understand for me, like, I don't know, I got curious about it when I was, like, 12, right? And there was no Google back then, so you used to have to, like, fuck with stuff and then, like, figure it out.
Yeah,
And then, like, you got really desperate, like, maybe you were gonna, like, dial into a long distance BBS to like post a question about something, but that was rare because like, my parents weren't going to be paying for long distance. And so, like the way that we had to learn to problem solve and figure things out in an environment where everything was broken though. So like, now when you're young, you can't just go like, let me start poking at this thing because, there's probably vulnerabilities in it, but it's probably a lot harder to find.
Yeah.
But when you're 12 and you're starting and you're like, I mean, I mean, it's very easy to like understand when like WinNuke exists or like what buffer overflows are when you can like crash
Yeah.
people and you're a 12-year-old troll. Like it's, you can
Yeah.
start to build a like set of knowledge, right? That I don't know how you replicate anymore. And it is, it's truly fascinating. It really is. And, but I think it's one of those things like, I know when Mike passed away a few weeks ago, I posted something uh where it's like whenever somebody that's been part of that community since really like the 90s informally and then beyond more formally because as I used to say my childhood hobby became a career field. Uh it, uh like it hurts extra deeply because like these are people who have a mindset and a knowledge and a way to approach problems that I don't know are replaceable, right? Not just as individuals, but as skill sets, even though they're also amazing humans. And there's this, I mean, I could talk for hours about the security community. So
Yeah.
I do miss it. And I'm sitting here, I'm like, do I go to RSA or do I go to this Mismo event, which is related to like, stuff that I'm doing for my startup? And yeah, I think I'm going to do
It's
Mismo,
tough.
but it's not going to be that
Yeah.
much longer before I start going to some security events again.
Yeah. Well, you definitely should because I'd love to see you at a conference sometime and hang out again. Those were great days.
Before
Just
our
hanging
knees
out
hurt
and
and our backs hurt.
oh my gosh, yeah, yeah, it's crazy. So how can our listeners follow you, find out more about what you're doing, and more about Stavvy?
Yeah, I mean, like in the olden days, I would be like, I'd give them one of the handles, and that would be
What's your
all they
handle?
needed.
Yeah.
My handle is now J Feinblum on
Yes.
Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. Also, Finside Chats on Spotify, Apple, all the other podcasts.
Nice.
Not nearly as cool as this podcast, but we try. We try, and honestly, like LinkedIn is probably one of the best ways. Twitter's fine. I'm easy to find with a simple Google. So I people feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Josh. We'll hopefully do part 2 when we get Kevin, uh, maybe in a couple weeks. But really great catching up, and you take care.
You too, Tom.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, hit that like and subscribe button. To catch all the latest from the show, visit our website, sharedsecurity.net. Follow us on Twitter at SharedSec, and join our Reddit community on the Shared Security Show subreddit.